Before a single American set foot on the island, the Japanese admiral who commanded it made his men a promise. He gathered them on a coral speck 2 miles long, in the middle of the Pacific, and told them what they had built there was beyond the reach of anything the United States could send. "1,000,000 men," he said, "cannot take Tarawa in 100 years. He was not boasting emptily. He had studied amphibious landings himself, and he had spent 2 years turning that island into something no one had ever attacked before. His name was Keiji Shibazaki, and he was almost right, in November 1943, and it is the fight that taught America what the road to Japan was actually going to cost. In 3 days on an island smaller than most airports, roughly 1,000 Marines were killed and more than 2,000 wounded. When the newsreels came home, the country was so shocked by what it saw that people wrote to Washington demanding to know who was responsible. And at the center of it is a 29-year-old lieutenant from El Paso, Texas, who was the first American onto that island, and whose commanding officer later said something about him that officers almost never say about a lieutenant. To understand why anyone wanted this place, look at a map. By late 1943, America had stopped Japan at Midway and clawed its way through Guadalcanal, and now Admiral Nimitz was ready to go on the offensive across the Central Pacific, a straight drive at Japan, island by island. The first stepping stone was the Gilbert Islands, and in the Gilberts, on the Tarawa Atoll, sat a little island called Batio with the one thing that mattered, an airfield. Whoever held Batio held the sky over that stretch of the ocean, so the airfield had to be taken, and the Japanese, knowing exactly that, had spent 2 years making sure it could not be. What they had built was an unsinkable battleship. Batio is 2 miles long and 800 yards wide, about 290 acres, smaller than many American farms. Into that space the Japanese packed 14 heavy coastal guns, 4 of them captured from the British at Singapore, and around 40 more guns of every caliber, plus light tanks and scores of machine gun nests in concrete and coconut log bunkers, sited so that their fields of fire crossed each other. Mortars were pre-registered on the seawall so that shells would land automatically on any man who reached it. There was nowhere on that island a man could stand and not be shot at. Shibazaki looked at it and made his promise. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and to give this video a like and stay with us all the way to the end. The man who would be first onto that island had one of the more unlikely backgrounds in the Marine Corps. William Deane Hawkins was born in 1914 in Fort Scott, Kansas, and raised in El Paso, Texas. As a small child, he was badly burned in a household accident, scalded so severely that doctors told his mother he might never use his hands or arms properly again. His mother refused to accept it and spent years working his hands and arms, over and over, until he could use them. He grew up scarred and he grew up stubborn. He was brilliant at school, finished as a teenager, and worked as an engineer. When the war came, the army turned him down because of the scars, so he went to the Marines instead. He became a scout sniper. By 1943, First Lieutenant Hawkins commanded the scout sniper platoon of the 2nd Marines, about 3 dozen hand-picked men whose job was to go in first, ahead of everyone, and find and kill whatever was waiting. His men called him Hawk. He had already been through Guadalcanal. He was known for 2 things, a complete unwillingness to ask anyone to do something he had not done first, and an attitude toward danger that his fellow officers found frankly unnerving. He told his men before Tarawa that he did not intend to come back. He said it the way you say a fact. The plan for Batio was built on a simple, confident idea. Hit the island with such overwhelming naval and air bombardment that the Marines could walk ashore over the wreckage. And the bombardment was, on paper, staggering, battleships and cruisers firing point-blank at a target the size of a small park, thousands of tons of shells. An admiral said the island would be obliterated. But Batio's bunkers were built of reinforced concrete and layers of coconut logs and sand, engineered specifically to absorb exactly that. When the guns finally lifted, the defenders climbed out of the rubble, shook off the dust, and manned their weapons. Almost everything the Americans believed about that morning was wrong. And one thing they had gotten wrong was the tide. Batio is ringed by a coral reef some 500 yards out from the beach. The whole landing depended on there being enough water over that reef for the boats to float across it. The planners knew the tides were unpredictable there. Some of them worried about it out loud. They went anyway, and on the morning of the 20th of November 1943, the tide did not come in. There was not enough water over the reef. which meant that the Higgins boats carrying thousands of Marines to the beach would grind to a halt on the coral 500 yards out, and the men inside would have to get out and walk. Hawkins did not wait for the beach. Sticking out from Batio into the lagoon was a long pier, 500 yards of it, and the Japanese had put machine guns along it that could fire sideways into every boat coming in. Someone had to take it, and take it first, before the landing alone in front of the entire invasion. That was the scout sniper platoon's job. Hawkins was the first man off the boat. He led 36 men onto that pier while the whole island's guns were still working, and they cleared it, position by position, so that the thousands of men behind them would not be shot in the back as they came in. It was the opening act of the battle, and it was over before most Marines had reached the reef. What happened at the reef is the thing the survivors never stopped seeing. The boats hit the coral and stopped, and the ramps went down 500 yards from dry land, and Marines climbed out into chest-deep water and started to walk. There is no cover in a lagoon. There is no speed. A man in chest-deep water moves at a crawl, holding his rifle over his head, and everything on the island that can shoot is shooting at him. It took some of them 20 or 30 minutes to cross that water. Whole boatloads did not get across. The men who did reach the beach reached it exhausted, half of them without the men they had started with, and pinned themselves against a coconut log seawall 4 feet high, with the pre-registered mortars already falling on it. By the end of the first day, the Marines held a strip of sand a few hundred yards long, and in places barely 20 yards deep. They had no armor to speak of ashore. Their radios were soaked, their officers were being killed at a horrifying rate, and their commander, Colonel David Shoup, was running the entire battle from behind a bunker with Japanese still alive inside it. It was, by any measure, on the edge of catastrophe. Back on the ships, senior officers read the reports and understood that the assault might have to be called off, that America might be about to lose its first offensive of the Central Pacific on a beach 800 yards wide. And on the other side of that seawall, something had gone wrong for Shibazaki too. His whole defense depended on his ability to move his men, to shift reserves from the unattacked side of the island to the beaches where the Marines were clinging on. To do that, he needed his command post and his telephone lines. American naval gunfire had cut the lines, and on the afternoon of that first day, Shibazaki was killed by American fire. The admiral who had promised 100 years was dead within about 6 hours of the first Marine reaching the beach. His garrison, thousands of men who believed his promise, now had to fight without the man who had made it. What Hawkins did over the next 30 hours is the heart of this story. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We're just getting to it. Because the problem on Batio, once the Marines were ashore, was arithmetic. That island held roughly 500 fortified positions, concrete pillboxes and log bunkers, each one with men and machine guns inside, each one covering the others. There was no way around them. Every single one had to be walked up to and destroyed by hand, by men in the open. That is what taking Batio actually meant, and nobody did more of it than a scarred lieutenant from El Paso who had already been wounded and would not go to the rear. His Medal of Honor citation lays it out in the Marine Corps' flat, careful language. It records that he was the first to disembark, that he moved forward under heavy fire at the end of the pier and neutralized the emplacements there. It records that on the following day he led an attack on a position held by 5 machine guns, walking up to it in the open with grenades, and that he was seriously wounded and refused to withdraw and kept going. He destroyed 3 more pillboxes after that. He was hit again. He kept going. His men begged him to go to an aid station. He told them the Japanese did not shoot straight enough to hurt him, and went back to work. It ended on the 21st of November, the second day. Hawkins was at the head of his men, attacking 3 more Japanese positions when a shell burst near him and the shrapnel killed him. He was 29 years old. He had, by the count of the men who were there, personally destroyed something like 9 pillboxes and machine gun nests while shot through the chest and carrying wounds he refused to have treated. His colonel, David Shoup, who won his own Medal of Honor commanding that battle, said the thing afterward that stuck. It is not often, Shoup said, that you can credit a first lieutenant with winning a battle. But Hawkins came as near to it as any man could. The island was taken. On the second day, the Marines got tanks ashore and artillery, and they began the grinding work of reducing the bunkers one at a time. Somewhere in the wreckage of his command, A Japanese officer sent Tokyo the last message the Betio garrison ever transmitted. "Our weapons have been destroyed," it said. "From now on, everyone is attempting a final charge." And then, at the end, the traditional words, "May Japan exist for 10,000 years." At 4 in the morning on the 22nd, the last 146 men on Betio rose out of their holes and charged the American lines. The charge was destroyed, and the promise of 100 years ended 76 hours after it was tested. 76 hours. Roughly 1,000 Marines and sailors killed, and more than 2,000 wounded, on an island of 290 acres. On the other side of the roughly 4,800 men who had defended Betio, about 4,690 were dead. 17 Japanese were taken alive. 17 out of a garrison of thousands. That is what Shibazaki's promise meant in practice. Not that the island could not be taken, but that every man on it would die making the Americans take it. He kept that part of his word absolutely. And here is the part that almost every telling of Tarawa leaves out. Those thousands of defenders were not all soldiers. Roughly 1,200 of them were Korean laborers, men brought to that island by an empire that had occupied their country, and put to work for 2 years building the fortress they would die in. They did not choose Tarawa. They did not make the promise. When the shooting stopped, 129 of them were still alive. So when we say 4,690 men died on Betio, we should be honest about who they were. Japanese sailors and soldiers who fought to the last, and hundreds of Korean workers who were simply there because someone else had decided they would be. What America saw was the film. Marine combat cameramen had gone in with the assault waves and photographed what happened in that lagoon, and when the footage was released, it showed the country something it had never been shown before. American dead, on an American beach operation, in numbers. People were stunned. Some newspapers demanded an investigation. Families wrote furious letters asking who had decided this was worth it. It was the first time the war stopped being a poster and became a bill. And the answer, the terrible, unsatisfying answer, was that the Marine Corps had just learned in 3 days how to do the thing that would win the Pacific. They learned everything at Tarawa, and they paid for all of it at once. They learned that naval bombardment does not obliterate concrete. They learned that you cannot gamble on a tide. Above all, they learned that they needed tracked landing vehicles that could crawl over a reef and carry men to dry land, instead of dumping them 500 yards out. And after Betio, they got them, in quantity. Every amphibious assault that followed in the Pacific, all the way to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, was planned by men who had read the Tarawa report. The Marines who waded that lagoon bought the lessons that kept the men behind them out of the water. When the shooting on Betio finally stopped, the Marines did something for Hawkins that they very rarely do. The airfield, the whole reason for the battle, the thing 1,000 Americans had died to reach, was renamed. They called it Hawkins Field, after a first lieutenant, not after an admiral, not after a general, not after the division. After the scarred kid from El Paso who had been first onto the pier and would not stop until a shell stopped him. In September 1944, his Medal of Honor was presented to his mother by President Franklin Roosevelt, the woman who had spent years working his burned hands until they moved, receiving the nation's highest decoration for what those hands did on Betio. Betio today is a quiet, crowded, ordinary place, one of the most densely populated islands in the Pacific, with people living their lives on top of a battlefield. The concrete bunkers are still there. Some of them have houses built against them. The wrecked hulks of landing craft still sit out on the reef where the tide left them, rusting in the shallows, exactly where the men had to climb out and start walking. Every so often, construction turns up the remains of an American Marine, and he is brought home, 80 years late, to a family that had long since stopped expecting him. They are still finding them. First Lieutenant William Deane Hawkins of El Paso, Texas, was 29 years old when he was killed on Betio on the 21st of November, 1943. He holds the Medal of Honor and 3 Purple Hearts. He rests at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, and an airfield in the middle of the ocean carries his name. About 1,000 Americans died in 76 hours on an island of 290 acres, and more than 4,600 men died on the other side, Japanese sailors who kept their admiral's promise to the last, and Korean laborers who never got to make one. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki was killed on the first afternoon, roughly 6 hours into the 100 years he had promised. 1 million men in 100 years. It took 18,000 Marines and 76 hours, and it very nearly did not at all, because a tide did not come in, and thousands of men had to climb out of their boats and walk 500 yards water into guns that could not miss. Shibazaki was what men will walk to his island. He was wrong about what men will walk through to reach it. People still argue about Tarawa. Whether the reef was a gamble no one should have taken, whether the lessons could have been learned any other way, and whether 1,000 lives for an airfield was a price worth paying. Maybe you have a view. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served at Tarawa, in the 2nd Marine Division, or anywhere in the Pacific, in any branch or any role, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did or said, or one thing you remember. The men who walked those 500 yards deserve more than a footnote. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.